Hey everyone, this is an entry from Robert J. Alexander's History of International Trotskyism. It's titled U.S. Trotskyism, the SWP, the YSA, and the New Left Movements in the 1960s. The mass political upheavals of the 1960s provided the Socialist Workers' Party and its youth affiliate, the Young Socialist Alliance, with unprecedented opportunities to extend their influence and to grow in membership. The upsurge of the civil rights movement in the early 1960s, the student upheavals, and the growing struggle against the Vietnam War, as well as the rebirth of the feminist movement, were among the major events of the period. At the same time, the evolution of the government of Fidel Castro into a self-proclaimed Marxist-Leninist regime had an important impact on U.S. politics, especially on left-wing activity. The quote orthodox end quote Trotskyists of the Socialist Workers' Party and the YSA became more or less involved in all these movements and events. They first threw themselves into the campaign in favor of the Castro regime, in which they played a leading role. Subsequently, they became very much involved in the anti-war struggle, in which they had a significant organizational part. Similarly, they became concerned with the black movement, although in a somewhat peculiar way. As a consequence, the Socialist Workers' Party was able to recover from the doldrums of the 1950s and gain more influence and a larger membership than ever before. However, the 1960s were not without their complications. For one thing, the Socialist Workers' Party's orientation during this period was not toward the working class and organized labor, but rather towards movements that were basically middle class in membership and leadership. This fact aroused some unhappiness within the party and generated extensive criticism from rival Trotskyist groups. Furthermore, the positions taken, particularly with regard to the U.S. racial problems, seemed to raise questions about the orthodoxy of the Socialist Workers' Party's policies from a Trotskyist point of view. Finally, the party's policies within the international Trotskyist movement were extensively debated and gave rise to a split of some consequence within SWP ranks. The Cuban Revolution. The Socialist Workers' Party greeted Castro's overthrow of Fulgencio Batista's government with the same enthusiasm shown by other radical and even liberal groups. When near the end of 1959, the new Castro regime moved in an avowedly Marxist-Leninist direction, the Socialist Workers' Party's enthusiasm intensified. By July 1960, Joseph Hansen, who became the chief spokesman on Cuban matters for the majority of the Socialist Workers' Party leadership, was qualifying the Castro regime as a, quote, workers' and farmers' government, end quote, of the kind defined in our transitional program, quote, a government independent of the bourgeoisie, end quote. End quote. Sorry, I missed the first opening quote, but you get it. He expounded on this definition by saying that, quote, by recognizing the new Cuban government as a, quote, workers' and farmers' government, end quote, we indicate its radical petty bourgeois background and composition and its origin in a popular mass movement, its tendency to respond to popular pressures for action against the bourgeoisie and their agents, and its capacity, for whatever immediate reasons and with whatever hesitancy, to undertake measures against bourgeois political power and against bourgeois property relations. The extent of those measures is not decisive in determining the nature of the regime. What is decisive is its capacity, is the capacity and the tendency, end quote. During the latter half of the 1960s, the Castro regime was drastically radicalized. It first nationalized virtually all U.S.-owned properties in the country, and a few weeks later took over most Cuban-owned means of production and distribution. These measures brought the Socialist Workers' Party to modify their definition of the Castro regime and to increase their enthusiasm. On December 23, 1960, the political committee of the party adopted a document entitled Draft Theses on the Cuban Revolution, which for the first time categorized the Castro regime as a, quote, workers' state, end quote. This document was then ratified at a plenum of the National Committee of the Socialist Workers' Party on January 14, 1961. The core statement of the, quote, theses, end quote, read, "The blows of these counter-revolutionary forces in turn compelled the Castro government to resort to increasingly radical measures, ... These included the establishment of a monopoly of foreign trade, the nationalization of the latifundia, and in August to October 1960, the virtual expropriation..." Sorry, I just realized I said something wrong earlier. It's not during the latter half of the 1960s, the latter half of 1960, the year. Anyway, the core statement of these, quote, theses, end quote, read, quote, "The blows of these counter-revolutionary forces in turn compelled the Castro government to resort to increasingly radical measures, ... These included the establishment of a monopoly of foreign trade, the nationalization of the latifundia, and in August-October 1960, the virtual expropriation of the American and Cuban capitalist holdings, that is, the key sectors of Cuban industry. These steps necessitated economic planning. This started in the fall of 1959, developed concomitantly with the nationalization of industry, and is now firmly established. All these measures were taken with the examples of the Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, Yugoslavia, and China available for study. Thus, in the final analysis, the overturn of property relations in Cuba is an echo of the October 1917 revolution in Russia. When the capitalist holdings in the key sectors of the Cuban economy were taken over by the government, Cuba entered the transitional phase of a workers' state, although one lacking as yet the forms of democratic proletarian rule, end quote. Joseph Hansen made the report on Cuba for the political committee to the January 1961 plenum. Joseph Hansen raised the issue of why the Socialist Workers' Party had not earlier labeled the Castro government a workers' state, saying that, quote, "In my opinion, the reason for this was the absence of a manifest socialist consciousness on the part of the leadership of that revolution," end quote. However, Joseph Hansen continued, quote, "This test of the Cuban Revolution, the test in struggle, was passed between the period of August to October in 1961, 3 months ago, when the industries were nationalized throughout the entire island, ... end quote, Joseph Hansen. As a consequence of the Socialist Workers' Party's, quote, conservatism, end quote, in waiting for the facts to justify the label of, quote, workers' state, end quote, Hansen said that, quote, "Now the conclusions that we have reached are not speculations, they're not projections, are not based on any political confidence in what the regime down there is going to do. Our characterizations simply reflect the facts, just the facts. The fact that the capitalists have been expropriated in Cuba. The fact that a planned economy has been started there. The fact that a qualitatively different kind of state exists there. No matter what you call these things, they are the facts that everyone has to start with," end quote. Joseph Hansen recognized the theoretical problems presented by the facts that a, quote, workers' state, end quote, had been established without the previous existence of a revolutionary party. Quote, "We're still left with the question, how are we to explain this victory in Cuba in the absence of a party like the Socialist Workers' Party? Let me explain that. There's no Socialist Workers' Party in Cuba, but how can they have a revolution down there in Cuba without the Socialist Workers' Party? Isn't there great danger involved in this? Doesn't this imply that no party is needed? Can you have a revolution without a party?" End quote. Joseph Hansen. After explaining that the kind of revolutionary party conceived of by the Trotskyist is a worldwide party, Joseph Hansen commented that, quote, "Thus we come to the conclusion that there is a great deal of unevenness in the growth and development of this party, ... Some countries can forge forward faster than others. In some cases, the action can transcend the political consciousness of it. Given this great unevenness in the development of an international party, we have to ask ourselves this question. Does this signify that it is impossible for the masses to overthrow a capitalist power in certain countries until the international party appears in full force and completeness, ... The answers are that in certain countries it is possible. Yugoslavia, China, and Cuba. That's the fact sheet, end quote. It's kind of bizarre. It's weird that they think that they would have the illusion that those... I don't know, it seems like maybe I'm wrong, it's just a comment, but it's like, just because those Leninist parties aren't the Socialist Workers' Party or affiliated with the Fourth International, does that not make them, I don't know, insurgent Leninist parties? But I don't know. What do I know? Throughout the 1960s, the Socialist Workers' Party continued to give virtually unconditional support to the Castro regime, although offering it, quote, advice, end quote, from time to time. Yeah, this is just a side note that, to my understanding, maybe I'm wrong, but all the native Trotskyists in Cuba were jailed subsequent to the revolution, which is better than a lot of other places Trotskyists fared once the revolution transpired. Anyway, throughout the 1960s, the Socialist Workers' Party continued to give virtually unconditional support to the Castro regime, although offering it, quote, advice, end quote, from time to time. Hansen wrote in 1966 that, quote, the militant has consistently printed the main declarations of Fidel Castro and Che Guevara, despite the limited number of pages at its disposal, and is a well-known source of truthful information about the Cuban Revolution, end quote. Even the suppression by the Castro regime of the only existing Trotskyist group in the island did not weaken the Socialist Workers' Party's support for the Castro government. The Cuban group was an affiliate of the Posadas version of the Fourth International, and after it offered criticisms of the failure of the Castro government to establish, quote, Soviets and establish, quote, workers' democracy, its publications were suppressed and its leaders were jailed. They were released from prison only after they signed a statement repudiating the Fourth International. Although at the time of the suppression of the Cuban Partido Obrero Revolucionario, the Socialist Workers' Party did not consider the issue sufficiently grave to weaken their support of the Castro regime. Hansen commented several years later that, quote, it was injurious to the Cuban Revolution to muzzle the Posadas group, ... Was the Cuban Revolution so weak ideologically that it was incapable of answering the arguments of even a Posadas, end quote? Hansen noted that, quote, particularly in the United States, ... the suppression of the Posadas group did injury to Cuba. There were few campuses where the violation of the democratic rights of the Posadas group was not thrown at defenders of the Cuban Revolution, ... end quote. The Fair Play for Cuba Committee. The attitude of the majority of the Socialist Workers' Party leadership toward the Cuban Revolution and the Castro regime played a major role in the split within the party which took place in the mid-1960s. It was a major matter of contention between the Socialist Workers' Party and its former allies in the International Committee of the Fourth International and the Socialist Labour League of Great Britain headed by Gerry Healy. However, their work on behalf of the Castro regime gave the Socialist Workers' Party the first chance in a long while to reach out and win recruits among elements which until then had not even been in the periphery of the Socialist Workers' Party. We deal elsewhere in this volume with the role of the Cuban issue in the internal and international Trotskyist polemics. Here it is sufficient to note that the role which the Socialist Workers' Party played in the early 1960s in defending the cause of the Cuban Revolution outside the ranks of the party and its periphery. The work of defending the Cuban Revolution before public opinion in the United States was undertaken principally by what came to be known as the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. This group was established as the direct result of the reception organized by the Cuban Consulate General in New York City for, quote, Friends of Cuba, end quote, on April 1st, 1960. At that meeting, Berta Pla, cultural attaché of the Consulate General, explained that she was interested in trying to establish some kind of organization of Americans with the principal purpose of telling the truth about Cuba. She also commented that she and others in the Consulate General would certainly quit their jobs and join the opposition if they were convinced that Fidel Castro was a communist, or that he was following the advice of the communists, or that in any way the government was communist. The members of the Socialist Workers' Party played a leading role in the work and leadership of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. Tom Woolford, who in the early 1960s was one of the leaders of the opposition within the Socialist Workers' Party, some years later summed up the role of the party in the pro-Castro movement. He wrote that, quote, the pro-Cuba forces in the United States, the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, were to become the new regroupment arena and the major arena for party work. These pro-Cuban forces were essentially the same petty bourgeois radicals the Socialist Workers' Party had sought to reach during the regroupment. As time passed, the pro-Cuban forces began to drift away, and those remaining grew increasingly hostile to the Socialist Workers' Party as Cuba worked closer with the USSR. Finally, the Fair Play group formally dissolved itself in the wake of the Kennedy assassination, but long before this it had lost its steam, end quote. Woolford insisted that, quote, out of all of this effort, the Socialist Workers' Party did not gain more than a handful of recruits, end quote. Woolford might have added that this work in the Fair Play Committee did serve to put the Socialist Workers' Party in contact with many of the same kind of elements with whom they were to work in other fields, particularly in the anti-Vietnam War movement and perhaps to some degree in the civil rights movement. It also brought into the party a number of young people who a few years later were to take over the Socialist Workers' Party leadership. The Socialist Workers' Party view of its role in the Cuban Revolution. There is no doubt that the leaders and members of the Socialist Workers' Party then and later had an exaggerated view of the importance of their relationship with the Cuban Revolution. They were convinced they were vicariously playing a role in leading, quote, the first socialist revolution in America, end quote. This view was well illustrated by Jack Barnes, by then National Secretary of the Socialist Workers' Party, and in the early 1960s a leader of the Young Socialist Alliance, at a meeting celebrating the 20th anniversary of the victory of the Castro forces on December 31st, 1978. At that gathering, Jack Barnes recalled that, quote, we made a block with the Castro team against the Stalinists from the beginning. We did that because the Stalinists have been the number one internal enemy of the Cuban Revolution, end quote. Sounds bizarre. It's also weird with when you're talking about left history, like when people use the word Stalinism, like, not that I don't think it's like, obviously it's a real and extremely damaging thing, and sometimes it's fairly obvious, but like, what party, I guess within communist parties, I'm not sure, but I guess there's like tension between like the like, with like Maoism, they're all like pro-Stalin people that thought that, were against the revisionism of the Khrushchev era and thought Khrushchev ruined the Soviet Union or something to that effect. And it seems like most of the most ardently Stalinist of the communist parties people broke with the communist parties. Like, for example, like how, I don't know. This is not that I say I know. I'm just curious how much you could call, I don't know, the Italian Communist Party and say like the 1970s Stalinist, and how much could you call the Soviet Union after Stalin Stalinist? Like, what would be the necessary features and for a social system or a body of political ideas to be labeled Stalinist? Like, where is the limit point? Like, is it like, because the reason that I said that was strange just now, what Barnes said about, the Stalinists being the number one internal enemy of the Castro regime. I thought that maybe I'm under the wrong impression, but I thought, you probably, people listening to this know better than me, but I thought like Cuba was in a very, very strong relationship with the Soviet Union, and in fact, that's why it embraced Marxism, Leninism, when it didn't before. I thought that the Soviet Union were like, I don't know, probably their strongest international ally. And would you call this? And so, would you call them? Would you call, if that's the case, if the the government's main allies, the USSR, in the 1960s, how much could you say that like Stalinists were an actual threat to the Cuban regime? That just seems kind of bizarre to me. Barnes went on to say that, quote, there have been and are today two basic wings inside the current Cuban Communist Party, the Castro wing and the Stalinist wing. We made a block with Castro against the Cuban Stalinists in the fight against the bureaucratic course of Anibal Escalante in the early 1960s, and later in the conflict with the Stalinists internationally over defense of the Vietnamese Revolution and the Cuban leadership's efforts to extend that revolution to Latin America. We learned how to block with Castro against the Stalinists in the fight to defend and extend the revolution, and that conflict between the Castroists and the Stalinists is still going on, end quote. Barnes summed up the vicarious participation of the Socialist Workers' Party in the Cuban Revolution by saying that, quote, we discovered that the real line to be drawn is the line between the revolutionists, meaning Castro and those around Castro, including us, and the counter-revolutionaries on the other side, including the Stalinists and the so-called, quote, third camp, end quote, Social Democrats, end quote. The anti-Vietnam War movement. During the latter half of the 1960s and early 1970s, the Trotskyists of the Socialist Workers' Party concentrated the largest part of their attention and activity on the fight against the war in Vietnam. Julius Jacobson, one-time Socialist Workers' Party member and former Shachtmanite, writing in 1976, admitted that, quote, the one organization strengthened by the anti-war movement was the Socialist Workers' Party, end quote. Julius Jacobson remained a Shachtmanite insofar as he remained committed to the early Shachtman, whereas the later Shachtman embraced more Cold War liberal type of socialism. I think Shachtman remained a socialist, but was rather warm to American imperialism in other places. So, for example, I think Shachtman supported the war in Vietnam, amongst other things. And so people that remained within the third camp stepped away from Shachtman when he began to embrace those kinds of positions. And that's the kind of position that I believe Julius Jacobson embraced. Julius Jacobson, I have a couple pieces from him. I have one called Isaac Deutscher, The Anatomy of an Apologist, and I have one titled The Two Deaths of Max Shachtman, which kind of chronicles the radical change that took place in Shachtman's politics as the 1950s wore on. Yeah. So it's kind of weird for Alexander to say that he was a former Shachtmanite. It kind of sounds like Max Shachtman was a former Shachtmanite. The Socialist Workers' Party paid relatively little attention to the Vietnam War until the decision of President Lyndon Johnson soon after his re-election to greatly intensify the struggle by sending large numbers of United States troops to the battlegrounds. In the party's 1964 platform, the only mention of the war was a one-sentence reference in its foreign policy plank, quote, "stop the, quote, dirty war," end quote, in Vietnam, end quote. Fred Feldman has noted that, quote, "the anti-war movement traces its origins to the call issued in December 1964 by Students for a Democratic Society for a march on Washington on April 17, 1965, 20,000 persons marched on April 17th. A majority of them were college students," end quote. Feldman went on to say that, quote, "the main burden of anti-war organizing fell on local and national coalitions made up of students, traditional peace groups, radicals, and other forces. They focused on building mass street actions on a united front basis, ... end quote. The Socialist Workers' Party and the Young Socialist Alliance were very active in the fight against the war, which began to mushroom early in 1965. At the first convention of the organization established to bring together the scattered local anti-war groups, the National Coordinating Committee to end the war in Vietnam, they represented the single largest political group there. At that meeting in November 1965, the Socialist Workers' Party YSA contingent fought for two things which they were to continue to push so long as the anti-Vietnam War struggle continued: concentration on the issue of withdrawal of the United States troops from the Vietnam conflict, and openness of the anti-war organizations to people of all political orientations. Aligned against them were Communist Party, Maoist and New Left elements, and their only allies were a small contingent from the Youth Against War and Fascism, the youth group of the Workers' World Party. Although the Socialist Workers' Party YSA delegates by no means won everything they wanted from this meeting, they were obviously regarded by delegates of other tendencies as, quote, "the ones to beat," end quote. In 1966, a new group, the Student Mobilization Committee to End the War in Vietnam, was established. Fred Feldman noted that, quote, "this remained the most important student anti-war organization during the next 6 years," end quote. The very anti-SWP periodical, The Campaigner, published by the so-called National Caucus of Labor Committees, admitted in 1970 that, quote, "the YSA faction of the Student Mobilization Committee succeeded in gaining momentary or organizational hegemony over the majority of the former SDS forces, by its, quote, non-exclusionist, end quote, tactic approach to the organization at the Cleveland Conference, ... The YSA at this juncture was the only socialist organization with the physical means to secure hegemony over student radical and related forces, ... End quote. A bit after the establishment of the Student Mobilization Committee, a new umbrella anti-war group was established, the New Mobilization Committee to End the War in Vietnam, quote, New Mob, end quote. David McReynolds said of the New Mob that the New Mob, quote, can be characterized as follows. First, the New Mob was a single-issue grouping drawn together by its opposition to the war in Vietnam. Second, the New Mob was essentially a single-tactic group sticking to mass legal demonstrations, avoiding both political action and civil disobedience. Part of this, quote, single-issue, quote, / single-tactic, end quote, approach was dictated by the fact there never really was a, quote, mob, end quote, structure, with offices, paid staff, a publication of its own, etc. The mob was simply the creation of a wide range of groups, from the Communist Party to the Catholics, from Quakers to student radicals, that recreated itself each time the mob called a national rally, end quote. It was the New Mobilization Committee which organized the massive anti-war demonstrations of the late 1960s. In November 1969, the New Mobilization Committee mobilized 250,000 to demonstrate in Washington and 100,000 in San Francisco, and at the time of the Cambodian invasion of May 1970, the New Mobilization Committee, quote, in less than 10 days assembled 100,000 persons in Washington, end quote. McReynolds, a socialist/pacifist, described the Trotskyite tactics within the anti-war movement. McReynolds wrote that, quote, for several years the Socialist Workers' Party had argued for a single-issue movement, partly because the Socialist Workers' Party felt a more radical movement would have a narrower base, but also because a bland single-issue movement was an ideal recruiting ground for the Trotskyists. So long as the peace movement stuck to just one issue, those who became more radical within the peace movement's ranks found themselves drawn toward the more radical program of the Socialist Workers' Party, end quote, McReynolds. McReynolds added that, quote, the Socialist Workers' Party not only opposed the extremist positions of the Radical Caucus, but opposed any broadening of the MOB, or the New Mobilization Committee. As a consequence of these internal strains, the Socialist Workers' Party, the Radical Caucus, and the, quote, centrist, end quote, group, MOB, died in 1970, almost at the instant of the MOB's massive demonstration in Washington on May 9th, end quote. As a result of the breakup of the New Mobilization Committee, three major anti-war groups were formed. One of these was the National Peace Action Coalition, NPAC, which David McReynolds said was, quote, almost entirely a creation of the Trotskyists, end quote. David McReynolds added that the National Peace Action have only one issue, Vietnam. The National Peace Action have only one tactic, mass legal rallies, end quote. Speaking of the April 24th, 1970 rally against the war, David McReynolds said that, quote, because of the National Peace Action Coalition's genuine ability, not simply because the National Peace Action Coalition took the more moderate line, the National Peace Action Coalition secured almost the entire establishment as sponsors, ... end quote. The Socialist Workers' Party sought to carry out anti-war activity not only among the civilian population, but among members of the armed forces as well. For instance, in the Socialist Workers' Party's 1968 election campaign, in which Fred Halstead was their presidential nominee, quote, about 115,000, quote, letters to GIs, end quote, by Fred Halstead were distributed to GIs and anti-war activists in England, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, and Germany, as well as throughout the United States. On Fred Halstead's trip around the world last summer, Fred Halstead talked to GIs in Vietnam and in Germany, and he reported the anti-war feeling among them in his meetings and press conferences when he returned to the United States. Fred Halstead attended the court-martial of SP/4 Alan Myers at Fort Dix and was thrown off the base for distributing campaign and anti-war literature to GIs, end quote. As President Nixon's policy of, quote, Vietnamization, end quote, of the war progressed, and after the establishment of the, quote, lottery, end quote, draft, the impetus of the anti-war movement declined. Another factor contributing to this was undoubtedly the success of many of the groups which have been most engaged in the anti-war movement in penetrating the organization of the Democratic Party, culminating in the nomination of Senator George McGovern in 1972, thus diverting the attention and energies of these people from concentrating on the anti-war campaign. The Socialist Workers' Party continued to control the National Peace Action Coalition, NPAC, faction of the anti-war movement so long as it existed. The National Peace Action Coalition held a convention in December 1971 in Cleveland, which was reportedly attended by 1,400 people. The periodical of one of the anti-Socialist Workers' Party political groups with representation at this meeting, the International Socialist, reported that, quote, the small size and uninspired atmosphere reflected the most recent anti-war marches on November 6th, end quote. The same periodical opined that, quote, the decline of the anti-war movement, and the anti-war movement's failure to overcome its isolation from the labor revolt pose a grave threat to the future of the struggle against the imperialist war, end quote. The Black Struggle of the 1960s. The members of the Socialist Workers' Party and Young Socialist Alliance played only a minuscule role, if any, in the major civil rights struggles of the 1960s. The Socialist Workers' Party and the Young Socialist Alliance had no visible connection with the organizations built around the work of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or with the labor-oriented groups in which A. Philip Randolph and Bayard Rustin figured most prominently. The reasons for this lack of participation in the major organizations conducting the black struggle of the 1960s are probably several. First of all, the Socialist Workers' Party's quite limited resources were very largely taken up with first the campaign on behalf of the Castro regime, and then the struggle against the Vietnam War. In the second place, the Socialist Workers' Party did not approve ideologically either with the nonviolent emphasis of Dr. King and his supporters or the orientation of the Randolph-Rustin group toward cooperation with established leaders in the organized labor movement. The lack of participation in the mainstream civil rights movement did not mean that the Socialist Workers' Party was oblivious to black concerns and the struggle of the period. The Socialist Workers' Party indicated their interest, among other ways, by naming a black, Clifton DeBerry, as their candidate for president in 1964, and by their nomination of Paul Boutelle, another black, for the vice president in 1968. Party platforms dealt extensively with problems of black struggle. That of 1964, for instance, called for, quote, full economic, social, and political equality for the Negro people, and for all other minority groups. Solidarity with mass actions aimed at securing these rights is exemplified in the rent strikes, school boycotts, picketing of construction sites, public demonstrations, and sit-ins. Uphold the right of self-defense against white supremacist violence, end quote. The 1964 platform went on to demand, quote, full use of the federal power to enforce all laws and court orders against discrimination and segregation, enforce existing laws against lynch murder and police brutality, and enact new ones, establish an FEPC with teeth and compensate minorities for the disadvantages they have suffered, create a federal agency fully empowered and equipped to enforce minority rights in all spheres of national life. Federal action to guarantee and protect the right to vote in all national, state, county, and city elections. Abolish all existing poll taxes, end quote. Finally, the platform urged, quote, teach Negro and African history in the nation's schools. Combat all forms of anti-Semitism, end quote. The Socialist Workers' Party, Malcolm X, and Black Nationalism. In 1964 and 1965, and for some time thereafter, the main concentration of the Socialist Workers' Party, insofar as the black struggle was concerned, centered on the figure of Malcolm X and more broadly on the, quote, black nationalist, end quote, current in black politics. George Brightman became the party's principal spokesman in these endeavors. Among other things, he edited a pamphlet on Leon Trotsky, on black nationalism and self-determination in 1967, edited a book of speeches, Malcolm X Speaks, and wrote a book, The Last Year of Malcolm X, The Evolution of a Revolutionary, and gave many speeches and wrote various articles about Malcolm. Malcolm X had joined the Black Muslims, or Nation of Islam, led by Elijah Muhammad in 1952, and by the early 1960s was the group's principal figure in the New York area. However, in early 1964, he broke with Elijah Muhammad, at first organizing his own mosque in New York and then establishing a more political group, the Organization of Afro-American Unity. Malcolm X also made 2 trips abroad, one of them including a hijra to Mecca. At least in part due to these foreign travels, Malcolm X substantially altered his thinking, moving away from the extreme anti-white teachings of Elijah Muhammad and coming more to view the struggle of the blacks as part of a wider conflict involving all elements in U.S. and international society oppressed by existing social, economic, and political institutions. Malcolm X was assassinated on February 21st, 1965, less than a year after his split with the Black Muslims. I'm trying to think, I'm having some thoughts right now. I'm trying to think, one of the main Malcolm X biographers is a guy named Manning Marvel. I think that's his name. And he kind of puts forward the idea, at least in one talk that I heard by him, something to the effect that Malcolm X, the autobiography of Malcolm X, is relayed by Alex Healy, I believe. One of the, he said something to the effect that one of the agendas of Alex Healy was to use Malcolm X's story as like a counterweight to, as kind of like an expose of the Nation of Islam, to demonstrate the very like fucking like patriarchal and bizarre racial theories such as the theory of the Jacobians. Was it Jacobians? I can't remember. Which is like, there was once a peaceful, brilliant, beautiful black civilization that that was decimated by an evil scientist or something to that effect within Africa, who began playing with experimenting with skin pigmentation, and the people with the uh, eventually the African civilization kicked this doctor and his the experiments that and the subjects of his experiments out of Africa and forced them to Europe. Um, they were light skinned. They were just kind of light skinned when they moved to when they were forced to go to Europe. But over time, evolution took its course, and they eventually became white Caucasians. And then where they and in Europe, they built up treacherous, destructive civilizations, and then expanded outward and destroyed Africa and everywhere else in the world. So there's kind of like this weird ass, bizarre, like religious kind of theology of where race comes from that's very, very not social constructivist. Like race being a social construct is something that would be very foreign to the Nation of Islam ideology, as far as I understand it. Not an expert on this subject. Um, but he was kind of the biographer of Malcolm X kind of was saying that he was using Malcolm X's former affiliation with the Nation of Islam to make the more radical wing of the black or the civil rights movement look insane and discredited, which, if any of the things that are said are true, they do look insane. Um, Another person who, I don't know what their deal is, another talk that I listened to, I remember one time, I think it's Eunice G. Pollock. I don't know if she's, what her, like, academic status is. I think she's a professor somewhere. It was, like, the talk was very, very, like, partisan, but she was talking about, like, anti-Semitism within black political circles. And it's kind of very, like, the way she was talking was, like, very enraged and kind of, like, I don't know, unprofessional, it seems like. But she was kind of saying something that, even though she wasn't putting it in the same words as Marble, I can't, I'm saying his name wrong. It might be Marble. I'm not going to look it up right now. I'm not going to look up this woman's name, this professor's name. But she was basically saying, like, yeah, Malcolm X was in part of a anti-white, anti-Semitic organization a year before he died. The bulk of his political work was under the banner of anti-Semitic black nationalism. Hers was taught. She was so it was kind of like an interesting thing. It was like, on the one hand, this guy was the person who was Marble, who was more sympathetic, obviously more sympathetic to Malcolm X than that, was kind of almost saying the same thing, but in like a less way. It's like, oh, Alex Haley was using Malcolm X to disgrace the Nation of Islam, which he was just a part of, you know, within a year before he died. And then the other person was saying, is like, yeah, he was in a fucking crank anti-Semitic organization until a year before he died. So there's kind of like this idea is like, what is the actual legacy of Malcolm X, right? What is the actual what actually is to be saved from his legacy? And to the degree that he embraced patriarchal, anti-Semitic, anti-white forms of black nationalism, to me it doesn't seem like much, but who am I? I mean, I remember when I was a young man, so I'm thinking about Malcolm X now. So I don't know, I graduated high school in 2010. And I went to community college, and I had professor, I had two classes. I had an English class, and we read the autobiography of Malcolm X, and then in another class, I had a history of hip-hop class. We're talking about Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, and me being at the time kind of like, I think like a lot of people who get involved in radical politics just see like the you know, the injustices and the horror of the world, um, and kind of feel like real like angry about it. And so that anger kind of translates into a sympathy for the most militant wing of anything. So, of course you support, the guy who's angrier and the guy who's saying the more, uh, you know, by any means necessary kind of deal. And I remember it was a very interesting situation. I'll never forget this. Um, it was the professor asked the class, it was a black woman. I was one of the white guys in the class. I always liked hip hop music. So I was like soaked on the class, and I liked learning about fucking hip hop and uh, the history of it, which I was sadly fairly ignorant of and still am. But she asked the class, who, you know, based on what we've learned about, Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, and most of the class was black people, who here likes what Martin Luther King had to say more, and who here likes to say, who likes what Malcolm X has to say more? And I raised my hand for Malcolm X, but literally all the black people within the class raised their hand for Martin Luther King. And the professor, like I said, a black one, was like, Thomas, Malcolm X didn't really have much of a place for you within his framework. And I was like, yeah, but I like the by any means necessary aspect of his thinking. And it's weird because I've definitely changed my view since then. I've definitely come to view like the humanist universalism of Martin Luther King way more warmly than I view the kind of like separatist kind of race essentializing nationalist discourse of Malcolm X. But it was interesting though, because you'd think it's kind of weird because like I suppose other people within the radical movement would like if there's a radical bookstore in my city, and they have posters up of Malcolm X along with um, you know and it's like I know they wouldn't have something of Martin Luther King in there, or maybe they would, I don't know, but it was interesting to me because like it's interesting to me because there seems like an important distinction to be made between like radicalism, especially emancipatory radicalism, and just extremism or non-emancipatory radicalism. And the more that I've gotten older, I think that the kind of universalist kind of like humanist um, aspect that kind of seeks to overcome social constructs, whether that be race or the value form, in order to establish a situation which Marx would call, an overthrow of the situation where any human beings are, whatever he says, marked, whose social relations make them, an oppressed, despicable, uh, crippled human being. And overcoming those conditions and creating creating a society where substantial fulfillment for individual human lives becomes the goal. I think I don't know at what point I moved more into that direction or became more like thinking about issues in terms of universalism and all that. But I would suppose at least part of the motivation towards that for me was kind of like seeing the kind of like a certain left-wing misanthropy, I would say, towards so-called normies, or just like generically slapped term white people, and thinking it was just kind of like, I don't know, just kind of nasty and unclear-sighted, and led people to sympathize with reactionary politics that didn't seem like reactionary politics because they weren't undertaken under the banner of white supremacy. For example, Islamism, and represented by people like groups like Hamas and Hezbollah, which you see in a lot of radical circles, people openly celebrating those groups, with people like Jeremy Corbyn calling them friends, or Judith Butler calling them part of, the international progressive left, or whatever the exact quotation was. But yeah, I it's funny because it was just like I just moved away from that kind of. I moved away from that necessarily like fucking like chest thumping like radicalism that's just like, you know, extreme, and thinking about what is the actual emancipatory content of that. Because the same person who likes, not necessarily, but oftentimes the same person who, um, really likes by any means necessary gauges the success of the Soviet Union based upon how many former rich people were murdered or made slaves. Um, and that's not emancipatory at all. Um, so yeah, basically back to the thinking, back to the piece, and Malcolm X. Uh, lived most of his life as the spokesman of a very reactionary organization. Last year of his life, stepped away from it. How severely he stepped away from it, I guess, is an open question. And what is his actual legacy? Uh, anyway, let's continue reading on. Let's see how the Socialist Workers' Party interacted with his thought. George Brightman, in his book on Malcolm X's last year, argues that even while he was still a black Muslim, quote, what he learned about such organizations as the Socialist and Communist parties did not make him friendly. Quote, ... One exception was Malcolm's attitude to The Militant, the weekly newspaper expressing the views of the Socialist Workers' Party. While he was still a black Muslim, but Malcolm used to buy this paper when it was sold at meetings where he spoke. Even at that time, he said after the split, he used to tell Negroes it was a good paper and they ought to read it, end quote. Brightman also insisted that relations between Malcolm X and the Socialist Workers' Party, quote, continued throughout Malcolm's last year and were closer at the end than at the beginning, end quote. There certainly was considerable contact between the Socialist Workers' Party and Malcolm X during this period. He spoke at 2 meetings of the Socialist Workers' Party's Militant Forum in New York City in April and May 1964. Brightman also maintained that Malcolm X supported the Socialist Workers' Party's 1964 presidential election campaign, albeit very discreetly. He wrote, quote, Brightman wrote, quote, another speaker at this May 29th meeting was Clifton DeBerry, the Socialist Workers' Party presidential candidate in 1964. In the discussion period, Malcolm praised DeBerry's formulation of the need for a combination of firmness in principle and flexibility in tactics. A few weeks later, in a private discussion with DeBerry, Malcolm said that he sympathized with DeBerry's candidacy and that, of course, he was not going to support either the Democrats or the Republicans in the election. For various reasons, however, he felt that he could not openly endorse DeBerry. What he could do, he said, was to, quote, open some doors, end quote, for DeBerry in Harlem so that he would get a better hearing for his program and greater circulation for his literature. Malcolm did make such arrangements before his second trip to Africa in July, and before leaving he urged his closest co-workers to cooperate where possible with the Socialist Workers' Party campaign, end quote. Writing soon after Malcolm X's break with the black Muslims, Brightman summed up the positive elements which the SWP saw in the new position he was adopting. These were, quote, one, a positive activist attitude toward the immediate day-to-day struggles for better jobs, schooling, and housing, ... Two, an advanced position on self-defense, ... Three, a different approach to politics, ... Four, promotion of black unity, end quote. Brightman concluded that, quote, revolutionary socialists who understand the progressive and revolutionary content of black nationalism approve and support the course he is following and the contribution he is making to the mobilization of the Negro masses against an oppressive system, ... end quote. The Socialist Workers' Party's relation with Malcolm X reflected their general sympathy for, quote, black nationalism, end quote. They did not interpret this as necessarily meaning the separation of American blacks into a nation of their own, such as had been advocated by the Communist Party in the early 1930s. In their pamphlet on Trotsky's attitude toward black nationalism, they republished a resolution on the subject which had been passed by the party's convention of July 1939. It proclaimed that, quote, the Socialist Workers' Party, while proclaiming its willingness to support the right of self-determination to the fullest degree, will not in itself in the present stage advocate the slogan of a Negro state in the manner of the Communist Party of the USA, end quote. The 1939 resolution added that, quote, the advocacy of the right of self-determination does not mean advancing the slogan of self-determination. Self-determination for Negroes means that the Negroes themselves must determine their own future, end quote. The resolution warned that, quote, furthermore, a party predominantly white in membership, which in present-day America vigorously advocates such a slogan, prejudices it in the minds of Negroes who see it as a form of segregation, end quote. Finally, the 1939 resolution promised that, quote, the Socialist Workers' Party will watch carefully the political development of the masses of the Negroes, will emphasize their right to make this important decision themselves, and the obligation of all revolutionaries to support whatever decision the Negroes may finally come to as to the necessity of a Negro state. The Socialist Workers' Party recognizes that the Negroes have not yet expressed themselves on this important question, ... end quote. In its 1963 convention, the Socialist Workers' Party again distinguished its conception of black nationalism from the call for a separate nation. A convention resolution stated that, quote, Negro nationalism, as it now exists, should not be equated with Negro separatism, the tendency that advocates creation of a separate Negro nation, ... Nationalists want the right to decide their own destiny and to create an independent movement and other conditions that will make it possible for them to decide their own destiny. But so far they have not made a choice in favor of a separate nation, end quote. The Socialist Workers' Party did interpret, quote, black nationalism, end quote, to mean independent black political action. In their 1964 platform, they wrote that, quote, the Socialist Workers' Party supports independent Negro political action of the type manifested in the call for a Freedom Now party, end quote. The platform added that, quote, we urge the formation of an independent labor party based on the unions. We advocate an anti-capitalist political alliance of all who suffer discrimination and exploitation, black and white, in industry and on the land, in blue collars and white, ... end quote. 4 years later, the Socialist Workers' Party was still maintaining its support of black nationalism. Paul Boutel, the party's black vice presidential candidate, was reported to have been, quote, chairman of a workshop discussion on, quote, the black nation, end quote, At the National Black Power Conference held in Philadelphia August 27th to 29th, The Socialist Workers' Party candidate was also the featured speaker at the Washington State Nominating Convention of the Black Panther Party September 17th, end quote. An unsigned article in International Socialist Review early in 1968 explained the rationale of the support of the Socialist Workers' Party for an independent black party. It explained that, quote, the Socialist Workers' Party favors the formation of an independent party uniting Afro-Americans in political struggle for their just rights and freedom. It believes that black people have the democratic right to decide their own destiny and that without such a political instrument, they cannot effectively advance their immediate well-being or attain their ultimate goals, end quote. The article then went on to maintain that, quote, there is no contradiction between adhering to the ideas of revolutionary socialism and championing an all-black party. To be sure, the one is consciously opposed to the capitalist order, whereas the other may be only partially and potentially directed against its domination. But both will stand arrayed against a common enemy in the capitalist ruling class and should travel along the same road towards the same destination, end quote. Finally, the article argued that, quote, because black people are the most exploited, oppressed, and aroused part of the population, it is reasonable to expect that black people will become the first mass force to cut loose from the Democratic Party coalition and blaze a trail for others to follow. If they should establish an influential party of their own which carried through the fight against oppression and exploitation to the end, black Americans can be the vanguard of radical change in this country and play a decisive role in revolutionizing its political life, end quote. As part of their support for black nationalism, the Socialist Workers' Party strongly advocated, quote, community control, end quote, particularly in predominantly black neighborhoods. The most notable example of this was at the time of the New York City teachers' strike in 1968, against a move to transfer 19 teachers out of Public School 271 in the Ocean Hill-Brownsville area of Brooklyn during a struggle over community of schools in that area. The Socialist Workers' Party was proud that it worked to break the 1968 New York teachers' strike. The militant reported that, quote, the Socialist Workers' Party campaigners have been active in supporting the struggles of black and Puerto Rican The Socialist Workers' Party was proud that it worked to break the 1968 New York City teachers' strike. The militant reported that, quote, Socialist Workers' Party campaigners have been active in supporting the struggle of black and Puerto Rican communities in New York to control their own schools and have helped open schools closed by the United Federation of Teachers. Strike against community control of schools, end quote. The paper added that Socialist Workers' Party presidential candidate Fred Halstead, quote, in fact helped his community open the school that his daughter attends, end quote. Women's liberation. The Socialist Workers' Party was also aligned itself behind another of the movements which arose and gained momentum in the 1960s, that of so-called women's liberation, although none of the major figures in that movement belonged to the party. The Socialist Workers' Party position on the issue was one of more or less orthodox Marxism and was presented in a pamphlet by George Novak entitled Revolutionary Dynamics of Women's Liberation, issued in 1969. George Novak warned that, quote, some participants in the women's liberation movement ranks approach the intolerable predicament of their sex in a highly personalized and unpolitical way. They seek relief and release through some sort of psychological readjustment, anti-male attitudes, or by gathering together in small utopian communities, end quote. However, he added, quote, rational inquiry into the underlying causes of the age-long oppression of women is indispensable for working out the best ways and means of attacking and abolishing it, end quote. Such rational inquiry is provided by Marxism, Novak insisted. Novak noted that, quote, the Marxist explanation for the subjugation of women is based upon recognition of the fact that private ownership of the means of production plus the right of property inheritance was the prime condition for women's downfall. It persists today in the most developed countries because property and power are monopolized by the capitalist class, end quote. Hence, Novak insisted there are several severe limitations of the possibility of the women's struggle under capitalism. Quote, just as the bourgeois revolution transformed the southern chattel slaves into impoverished landless freedmen and then returned them to new forms of bondage, so bourgeois reforms have allowed women to escape from being a complete chattel of the male master and become a, quote, free individual, end quote, in the bourgeois sense. What they have not done is to release women from the grip of the man and give them equality in the decisive spheres of social life, end quote. Therefore, Novak explained, quote, it will take a thoroughgoing reorganization of the entire social setup from economic foundations up to and including family relations before women can eradicate the causes of their inferior status and the evils flowing from it. In order to accomplish that, a socialist revolution which will transfer state power and the means of production from the monopolists to the majority of the people must be carried through, end quote. Novak insisted that, quote, a democratic workers' regime and the collective ownership of the means of production are required for any fundamental and beneficent transformation of the relations between men and women. Husbands and wives, parents and children, ... The exploited of both sexes must make common cause in getting rid of the capitalist class structure behind their deprivations, end quote. Socialist Workers' Party electoral activity. Throughout the 1960s, the Socialist Workers' Party continued to run candidates in presidential elections and in local and state contests where the opportunity presented itself. Undoubtedly, a higher point of electoral campaigning came during the 1968 contest. The Socialist Workers' Party candidates for president and vice president in 1968 were Fred Halstead and Paul Boutel. In addition, the party ran 44 candidates for lesser posts, including Peter Camejo for U.S. Senator in California, Carl Finnemore for governor of Illinois, Bob Wilkinson, a Vietnam veteran, for governor of Wisconsin. All three had been active in the campus revolt in their respective states. Cliff Comer, who ran for U.S. Senator from Georgia, was the first Socialist Workers' Party candidate in the Deep South. During this campaign, the Socialist Workers' Party nominees made the most of the free television and radio time which was available to them as candidates. As the militant noted, quote, both Halstead and Boutel appeared on the popular Joey Bishop show, which was carried by some 250 stations nationwide. Halstead appeared on a national education television program carried by 140 stations, and Boutel appeared for 15 minutes on the Dick Cavett Show, a national ABC program broadcast by 250 stations. They appeared together for an hour on William F. Buckley's Firing Line show. This is only a fraction of the free radio television time the Socialist Workers' Party candidates were able to obtain, end quote. In view of the heavy emphasis which the Socialist Workers' Party was giving to anti-war work, particularly among students, much of the weight of the 1968 campaign was carried by the Young Socialist Alliance, to set up Young Socialists for Halstead and Boutel and Afro-Americans for Halstead and Boutel groups as campaign organizations. They sought endorsement from campus activists and claimed to have received them from people in all but 4 of the 50 states. They issued 3 numbers of a special periodical, Afro-Americans for Halstead and Beutel newsletter, which was widely distributed on campuses throughout the country. The 2 national nominees of the Socialist Workers' Party campaigned for the better part of a year. They addressed numerous campus audiences, including 800 people who heard Beutel at Arizona State University, 600 who listened to Halstead at the University of Wisconsin, and 350 each at Antioch College and State University of New York at Albany. In addition, Beutel spoke at a meeting organized by the Black Panther Party in Des Moines, and Halstead spoke before an anti-war demonstration of 30,000 people in San Francisco on April 27, 1968. The Socialist Workers' Party candidates were apparently able to address few, if any, labor audiences. The Socialist Workers' Party estimated that it had distributed upward of 1,500,000 pieces of literature during the campaign, including 100,000 copies of the Socialist Workers' Party platform. They posted some 309,600 campaign stickers. Special pamphlets were published, including 9,000 on the truth about the McCarthy campaign, and one explaining, quote, how the various peace and freedom party formations are in actuality an obstacle to the development of independent black and labor parties, end quote. The Socialist Workers' Party succeeded in getting on the ballot in 19 states, compared with only 8 in 1964. Intercontinental Press reported that, quote, the Socialist Workers' Party is on the ballot in Arizona, Colorado, Indiana, Iowa, Kentucky, Michigan, Minnesota, Montana, New Hampshire, New Jersey, New Mexico, New York, North Dakota, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, Utah, Vermont, Washington, and Wisconsin. The party also filed in Tennessee and Connecticut, but was arbitrarily ruled off. The party also filed in Tennessee and Connecticut, but was arbitrarily ruled off, During the campaign, an estimated 117,000 signatures were collected on nominating petitions by Socialist Workers' Party supporters, end quote. The Socialist Workers' Party summed up its electoral participation in 1968 by saying that, quote, all of these accomplishments of the Socialist Workers' Party campaign, demonstrated that revolutionary socialists can participate in the electoral process and register significant gains for the movement without in any way watering down or compromising their revolutionary principles, end quote. Changing class composition of the Socialist Workers' Party. With its attention and activity during the 1960s concentrated on anti-war activities, the black nationalist cause, electoral activities, and to a degree on the feminist movement, the Socialist Workers' Party had little energy or personnel left to carry out work in the organized labor movement. In any case, the atmosphere in the trade unions was not a propitious one for would-be revolutionaries. There was a considerable economic prosperity during most of the decade. Collective bargaining brought steady, if unspectacular, material gains for most union members, and the, quote, bourgeoisification, end quote, of the manual labor force undoubtedly proceeded apace. Under these circumstances, there were no significant movements of revolt against existing union leadership or large-scale new organizational campaigns, such as had given the Trotskyists their first and so far only opportunity to get a foothold in the organized labor movement. Although during the latter part of the 1960s there was substantial disagreement in the top echelons of the AFL-CIO over the Vietnam War, the Socialist Workers' Party attitude toward both contending groups in this dispute was one of almost equal hostility. Hence, not only did the Socialist Workers' Party do little to try to develop influence in organized labor, but the conditions were not conducive to success even if such efforts had been made. As a consequence, the process of transformation of the social base of the principal Trotskyist party in the United States, which had been underway for a long time, was undoubtedly intensified during the 1960s. The Socialist Workers' Party had lost some of its cadres in organized labor with the Shachtmanite split in 1940, but it more than recovered this loss around right after World War II. However, by the late 1940s, as we have noted, many of its wartime recruits among the workers were falling away, and it had totally lost its first notable labor base, Minneapolis. Then, with the Cochranite split of 1953, the Socialist Workers' Party lost the bulk of its activists in the organized labor movement. So as the Socialist Workers' Party entered the 1960s, it was already an overwhelmingly middle-class group. We have no reliable figures concerning the class or social composition of the Socialist Workers' Party at the end of the 1960s, but there is some evidence of the situation early in the decade. According to Lawrence Ireland, one of the leaders of the minority opposition in the 1961 to 63 period, quote, out of a Socialist Workers' Party population of around 400 to 500 members, it is doubtful if even as many as 10% can be said to be now employed in the concentrated industries, end quote. Lawrence Ireland defines, quote, the concentrated industries, end quote, as, quote, mining, contract construction, manufacturing, transportation, and public utilities, end quote. Lawrence Ireland went on to comment that, quote, in any event, the comrades so employed fail to constitute any trade union fractions, and for the most part occupy the more comfortable jobs available in these industries, end quote. Finally, Ireland said that racial minorities, quote, constitute only about 4% of the population of the Socialist Workers' Party, end quote. By the end of the 1960s, the Socialist Workers' Party was probably 2 or 3 times the size it had been a few years earlier, but only an infinitesimal number of its new recruits were members of the organized labor movement. The party was certainly much further away after the New Left decade from being what it had before aspired to be, the vanguard of the working class. It was, if anything, at best, the vanguard for the working class. Socialist Workers' Party ideological orientation in the 1960s and early 1970s. The kind of activities in which the Socialist Workers' Party and its youth affiliates centered their attention and recruiting efforts, and the change in class composition of the Socialist Workers' Party Young Socialist, YSA, I can't remember what it is. Is it Youth Socialist Alliance? Between the mid-1950s and the early 1970s resulted in a reformulation of the programmatic and ideological position of the major United States Trotskyist group. This alteration perhaps found its clearest expression in the Program for Revolution, the collection of documents emerging from the 24th National Convention of the Socialist Workers' Party in August 1971 and published in the International Socialist Review in November of that year. These documents put primary emphasis on what the Socialist Workers' Party conceived as a radicalization, end quote, then in process in the United States. This perspective was perhaps most clearly stated in a resolution entitled, quote, Perspectives and Lessons of the New Radicalization, end quote, adopted by the convention by a vote of 106 to 7. It stated, quote, since the 1969 convention of the Socialist Workers' Party, the process of radicalization has continued to deepen. Following the moratorium and march on Washington in October and November 1969, the anti-war movement achieved its broadest mobilization to date and most clearly demonstrated its potential in the May 1970 anti-war upsurge. During the same year, 2 powerful new contingents entered the radicalization in a massive way. The movement for Chicano self-determination and the women's liberation movement. This period also saw the emergence of the gay liberation movement, organized revolts in the prisons from New York to California demanding prison and judicial reform. Inspired by the nationalist radicalization, increased radicalization inside the Catholic Church, led by a militant layer of nuns and priests, deepening revulsion against capitalism's destruction of our environment, and the ecological system on which humanity depends, the continued formation of radical caucuses in all types of professional organizations, and intensified black nationalist sentiment and organization, and further anti-war radicalization within the army. Neither in the Debsian radicalization nor in the 30s were there comparable upheavals in these sectors of American life. End quote. The Socialist Workers' Party stopped short of claiming that all of this added up to a revolutionary situation. Jack Barnes, then Organization Secretary of the Socialist Workers' Party, in introducing the resolution on perspectives and lessons of the new radicalization to the plenum of the National Committee of the party in March 1971, which sent it for discussion to the party membership and ultimate adoption by the August Convention, made that point. Jack Barnes posed the question, quote, how do we fit these seemingly contradictory observations together, the idea that this is the deepest and broadest and most promising radicalization in American history, with the fact that the forces that compose the question of power and reorganize society on a new basis that were politically involved in the 30s in large numbers are not now on the march to the same degree, end quote. Jack Barnes answered his own question by saying that, quote, the decisive question for us in analyzing the depth and promise of the radicalization is not whether the working class self-consciously and in very large numbers is, at this point, involved. That does not settle this question. It does not belittle the radicalization to point out that the working class has not yet intervened in this manner. In fact, it indicates to us how powerful the radicalization will become with the large-scale involvement of the working class and the potential speed with which a pre-revolutionary situation could arise when that happens, end quote. Jack Barnes argued that the transformation of the, quote, radicalization, end quote, into a pre-revolutionary situation was virtually inevitable. Barnes said that, quote, in this radicalization we are seeing the rise of the self-conscious struggle and organization of America's oppressed nationalities and the beginnings of movement whose demands are so deep that they can only be begun to be met by a worker state. And we are seeing this prior to the large-scale participation by the working class in the radicalization, let alone a revolutionary upsurge, end quote. Barnes claimed that, quote, the questions of alienation of the hierarchical relationships necessary to capitalist society which foster and rationalize oppression based on class, race, sex, age, etc., of who controls one's life and work, all being raised by one or another different movement, become generalized and begin affecting the consciousness of the entire population, including the working class that directly faces all these problems. We also see a process occurring which is important in any radicalization and can eventually be a key factor leading to a revolutionary situation. That is the gradual decay of the moral authority of the rulers, the representatives, and their institutions, ... end quote. The Socialist Workers' Party's leadership's view was that the party's role in the, quote, radicalization, end quote, then underway was to acquire as much of a leadership position as possible and try to, quote, revolutionize, end quote, the radicalization. Barnes wrote that, quote, the key thing is that as the radicalization deepens, as new movements arise, as new sectors come into struggle, ... that we champion the progressive demands of these movements and we act as revolutionists toward them and in them. Then, as long as we're clear about our political principles, we should find no insurmountable obstacles to coming to grips with these movements, analyzing these movements, and incorporating generalizations and demands flowing from them into our program, end quote. The Socialist Workers' Party leadership paid due homage to the traditional Marxist-Leninist Trotskyist position that revolutionary process required the leadership of a revolutionary party, and that the party's principal task in the process of, quote, radicalization, end quote, was to form the cadres for such a party. Jack Barnes observed that, quote, in the final analysis, the decisive question is the construction of a mass Trotskyist party. We proceed from the recognition that the Socialist Workers' Party is not yet that mass party. We are a small but growing nucleus of cadres formed around the revolutionary socialist program necessary to build such a party. Thus, recruiting, training, and assimilating such cadres are the indispensable preconditions for building a mass workers' party, ... Today, our immediate goal is the recruitment of more and more of the young militants radicalized in the current political struggles, and the transformation of these recruits through education and experience into Trotskyist cadres, ... End quote. It is clear from the 1971 documents that the Socialist Workers' Party leadership felt the party's focus at that time had to be almost exclusively on the various elements then participating in the process of, quote, radicalization, end quote. They specifically rejected a direct attempt to influence the organized workers by getting party members into workplaces and union organizations. Barnes, in his report, noted that, quote, our opponents, all counterposed to our perspective, what they must think is a new discovery. Their strategy for party building is what the Communist Party calls a, quote, industrial concentration, end quote. What the IS calls, quote, workers' work, end quote. What Wolfforth modestly calls his, quote, proletarian orientation, end quote. What progressive labor calls the colonization of selected key plants, end quote. Etc. ... What they all come down to are subjective and arbitrary shortcuts by a handful aimed at bridging the objective gap between the pace and characteristics of the radicalization of the decisive sections of the working class and the growing radicalization of other oppressed sectors of the population. They ultimately come down to a gimmick substituting for a Leninist strategy of party building, end quote. Barnes specifically rejected the idea that any attempt should be made to have the overwhelmingly middle and upper class youths then being recruited to the Socialist Workers' Party YSA become, quote, proletarianized, end quote. Jack Barnes said in further discussion of the, quote, gimmick, end quote, he had already denounced that, quote, the second justification is what we call the, quote, class composition, end quote, justification. That is the idea that the central problem of a small group of cadres trying to increase their size and build the nucleus of a mass party is its class composition. This problem is, quote, solved, end quote, by telling everyone to get a job in industry. In other words, this is an attempt to solve the problem of building a proletarian party through taking a small group of cadres and substituting a transformation of the social composition of these cadres through colonization and industry for the construction of a cadre that will be the necessary nucleus of a fighting mass proletarian party, end quote. Alright, I'm going to get a cup of coffee real quick, sorry. Actually, let me drink some water first. You get to hear me drinking water. Alright, 1 second. Forgive me, people. I'm in the zone, but I need some coffee. Okay, we're back. All right, international activities of the Socialist Workers' Party. The Socialist Workers' Party played an active role in the international Trotskyist movement during the 1960s. Indeed, the nature of that role was the principal cause of internal dissension within the party during that period. In the early 1960s, there was a realignment within international Trotskyism. The nature of this is discussed at some length elsewhere in this volume. Here it is sufficient to note that because, on the one hand, of coincidence in outlook on the Cuban Revolution between the Socialist Workers' Party leaders and those of the, quote, Pabloite, end quote, International Secretariat, IS, and because of a drastic modification of the, quote, deep entrism into the, quote, into the Communist and Socialist parties, supported by the International Secretariat. My lovely mother sewed a button onto my shirt. Isn't that sweet? Here it is sufficient to note that because, on the one hand, of coincidence and outlook on the Cuban Revolution between the Socialist Workers' Party leaders and those of the, quote, Pabloite, end quote, International Secretariat, IS, and because of a drastic modification of the, quote, deep entrism, end quote, into Communist and Socialist parties supported by the International Secretariat, at the time of the split in the International in 1953 to 54, a rapprochement developed between the Socialist Workers' Party and the International Secretariat. At the same time, there was strong disagreement, particularly on the Cuban issue, between the Socialist Workers' Party leaders and their most important European associate, Gerry Healy of the Socialist Labour League of Great Britain. As a consequence of these developments, the Socialist Workers' Party and a few other groups which had been associated with the International Committee since 1953 to 54 withdrew from the International Committee and joined forces with the bulk of the adherents of the International Secretariat to establish in 1963 the United Secretariat of the Fourth International. By the end of the decade, a new struggle pitting the Socialist Workers' Party and some of its allies, particularly in Latin America, against the principal figures in the ex-International Secretariat had already begun. The factional struggle of the early 1960s. Still another factional struggle culminated in two separate splits in the Socialist Workers' Party took place between mid-1961 and early 1964. Although these new divisions did not result in a numerically large defection from the party, they were of some consequence to the Socialist Workers' Party. In the first place, the issue and controversy centered on key elements of the party's international policy, particularly its attitude toward the Cuban Revolution and its participation in the, quote, reunification, end quote, of the Fourth International in 1963. Second, it resulted in the defection of most of the young ex-Shachtmanite leaders who had been its most important recruits during the 1950s, as well as provoking the loss of a number of older individual figures. Finally, it resulted in the establishment of two small but persistent rivals to the Socialist Workers' Party for the mantle of Trotskyism in the United States, the Spartacist League and the Workers' League. Subsequently, an official publication of the Spartacists noted that concerning the origins of the new opposition group, the Revolutionary Tendency, RT, which appeared in the Socialist Workers' Party in 1961, quote, the nucleus of the revolutionary tendency originated in the central leadership of the Young Socialist Alliance and first came together as a left opposition to the Socialist Workers' Party majority's uncritical line towards the course of the Cuban Revolution, end quote. The Spartacists added that, quote, this preliminary dispute culminated in the adoption of a thoroughly revisionist position by the Socialist Workers' Party majority at the June 1961 party convention, end quote. Tim Woolforth, one of the principal leaders of the original revolutionary tendency, described further the nature of the new opposition. Tim Woolforth wrote that, quote, we began essentially as a section of the leadership of the youth organization, the YSA, the Young Socialist Alliance. Our strength then flowed from the fact that we represented the first new wave of revolutionary forces which has come to the party in the recent period, ... Essentially, the original core of our minority had little or no roots in the party and little experience at anything other than student work, ... When we began our oppositional work in the party, in many ways we were not really a part of the party. We were almost functioning as if we were an outside force, end quote. The new revolutionary tendency was not totally without influence. For one thing, Woolforth was a member of the political bureau of the Socialist Workers' Party. For another, it had the support of a few older leaders, some of whom shared its point of view, others of whom at least opposed the ultimate move of the majority to expel the dissidents. The most significant document generated by the revolutionary tendency was In Defense of a Revolutionary Perspective, a Statement of Basic Position, drawn up by Tim Woolforth with the cooperation of several other people and presented to the National Committee of the Socialist Workers' Party in March 1962. It was debated at the plenum of the National Committee in June 1962, where it was turned down 43-4. This documentation discussed at considerable length the origins of, quote, Pabloism, end quote, in the Fourth International, accused the majority of the Socialist Workers' Party of veering towards Pabloism in its willingness to accept in the Cuban case and elsewhere the possibility of the establishment of a workers' state under, quote, petty bourgeois, end quote, leadership, and without the previous existence of a revolutionary vanguard party. It also strongly criticized the Socialist Workers' Party leadership for seeking reunification with the International Secretariat of the Fourth International, headed by Pablo, and distancing itself from the International Committee of the Fourth International, which the Socialist Workers' Party had taken the lead in forming in the time of the split in the International in 1953-54. Quote, the Indorp document summarized its criticisms of the Socialist Workers' Party majority thus: we believe that the failure of the Socialist Workers' Party leadership to apply and develop the theory and method of Marxism has resulted in a dangerous drift from a revolutionary world perspective. The adoption and practice of the empiricist and objectivist approach of the Pabloites, the minimization of the critical importance of the creation of a new Marxist proletarian leadership in all countries, the consistent underplaying of the counter-revolutionary role and potential of Stalinism, the powerful tendencies towards accommodation to non-proletarian leaderships, particularly in the colonial revolution, these pose, if not countered, a serious threat to the future development of the Socialist Workers' Party itself, end quote. The revolutionary tendency document then presented a 10-point summary of its own position. The key elements were, quote, 1. We look to the working class and only the working class as the revolutionary force in modern society. 2. We consider the creation of the revolutionary Marxist parties, that is, Trotskyist parties, as essential to the victory of socialism in every country in the world. 3. We call for the revising of the traditional Trotskyist emphasis on workers' democracy as an essential part of our program and propaganda. 4. We hold that Stalinism is counter-revolutionary in essence, ... 6. We call for a political struggle against Pabloism internationally and Pabloite ideas and methodology within our own ranks, ... end quote. The Indorp also expressed support for reunification of the Fourth International, only, quote, on the political basis of a reaffirmation of the fundamentals of Trotskyism, ... End quote. Finally, it called for a return to the Socialist Workers' Party's, quote, Theses on the American Revolution, end quote, of 1946, and its emphasis on the Socialist Workers' Party, quote, as the American section of our world party, ... End quote. At its inception, the revolutionary tendency controlled a majority of the National Committee of the Young Socialist Alliance, although the Socialist Workers' Party majority soon succeeded in ousting them. The revolutionary tendency continued to consist of relatively young people. Some of its documents commented with acerbity on the superannuated nature of the majority leadership. Thus, a document on, quote, the centrism of the Socialist Workers' Party and the tasks of the minority, end quote, by James Robertson and Larry Ireland noted that, quote, the Socialist Workers' Party in its leadership has become a very old party. From 1928 to the present, 34 years, it has been led by the same continuous and little changing body of personnel. Thus it is the most long-lived, ostensibly revolutionary organization in history. Its current national committee must have one of the highest average ages of any communist movement ever, end quote. At the beginning, the revolutionary tendency was very small. Robertson wrote in October 1961 that, quote, we are a nominal 35 or so comrades, about 15 in New York City, ... In addition, a similar number in the Bay Area, ... Then there was a couple of valuable but isolated comrades, ... elsewhere, end quote. Subsequently, Woolforth claimed that it had been, quote, possible for us to consolidate our forces in the East Bay, to fuse with the working class cadres in San Francisco, Detroit, and Philadelphia, and to make a serious impact on the New Haven group, end quote. During the latter part of 1962, the already small revolutionary tendency broke into two separate groups. One was headed by Robertson, the other by Woolforth. The former tended to put much greater emphasis on factional work than upon work for the Socialist Workers' Party itself, and to be rather contemptuous toward party discipline. Woolforth, on the other hand, emphasized the need for the opposition through being very active in the party's, quote, external, end quote, work, and very careful about not violating Socialist Workers' Party discipline to avoid giving the majority any excuse for expelling the dissidents. The only effect of the more cautious attitude of Woolforth and his associates was to bring about their expulsion from the Socialist Workers' Party a little later than that of the Robertson group. In December 1963, Robertson, Larry Ireland, Lynn Harper, Shane Mage, and Jeff White were expelled. Subsequently, others of their group were thrown out, and soon afterward this group organized the Spartacist League. Woolforth and his supporters were expelled from the Socialist Workers' Party in 1964. They immediately formed the American Committee for the Fourth International, which in 1966 became the Workers' League. The Spartacists later summed up the schism in the Socialist Party, which occurred in the period following their own expulsion. They wrote that, quote, more revolutionary tendency supporters were expelled, then supporters of other tendencies, both left and right, Woolforth, Phillips, and Swabick, were pushed until they broke discipline, then were formally expelled, while local branches, New Haven, Seattle, and Milwaukee, left, end quote. Although most of these expelled were among the recruits of the late 1950s, a few older figures left. Joyce Cowley, one of the signers of the Indork document, was one of these. Another was Myra Tanner Weiss, three-time Socialist Workers' Party candidate for vice president. As a member of the political committee, she had represented a resolution to its November 1st, 1963 meeting opposing the expulsion of Robertson and the others, which concluded, quote, I propose that we apologize to the minority for the unwarranted investigation and express our desires to collaborate in comradely fashion in the future for the building of the Socialist Workers' Party, end quote. Soon afterwards, she resigned from the party. A few other older party leaders left soon after this for other reasons. The most important of these was Arne Swabic, a founder of both the Communist Party and the Trotskyist movement, who became an avowed Maoist. Arne Swabic was expelled in 1967, quote, for violations of discipline, end quote. Conclusions. In spite of the defection from the Socialist Workers' Party of many of those young people who had been recruited during the late 1950s, the Socialist Workers' Party grew substantially during the 1960s. It was able to benefit modestly from the mass movements against the Vietnam War and for black and women's rights. However, as a consequence, the social composition of the country's major Trotskyist group was greatly altered. Whatever remnants of a working-class membership the Socialist Workers' Party still had at the beginning of the 1960s was overwhelmed by the middle, lower, middle, and upper-class recruits who were brought in during the decade. Few workers were recruited. This change in the nature of the Socialist Workers' Party membership was to have important consequences in the following decade and a half. Thanks for listening.